October 17th, 1842. A violent storm raged across the North Atlantic as enormous waves crashed against the cliffs of Blackstone Island. Standing alone above the sea was Blackstone Lighthouse, a towering beacon that had safely guided ships home for nearly 70 years. Every night, 3 lighthouse keepers climbed its endless spiral staircase to keep the great lantern burning until sunrise. They never missed a single night. Then, without warning, everything changed. The next morning, a rescue crew arrived after the storm had passed. The lighthouse door was locked from the inside. The lantern still burned brightly. Dinner remained warm on the table. 3 untouched cups of tea sat beside overturned chairs. But the keepers were gone. There was no blood, no footprints, no sign of the struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The mystery became one of the greatest unsolved disappearances in maritime history. The investigation lasted for months, but every search ended the same way. Divers explored the freezing waters surrounding the island. Search teams inspected every inch of the lighthouse, from the cellar to the lantern room. Nothing was ever found. With no evidence and no survivors, the government blamed the disappearances on the storm and officially closed the case. But the fishermen who had spent their lives on these waters believed something far more terrifying had happened. They claimed that during the strongest storms, the abandoned lighthouse still came to life. Its powerful light would suddenly shine across the ocean, even though no keeper had lived there for decades. Every old sailor repeated the same warning to anyone willing to listen. If the Blackstone Light ever calls your name, never answer. Most people dismissed it as another ghost story, until the autumn of 2026, when marine historian Ethan Carter received a mysterious wooden box that would change his life forever. Inside the box was an old brass key, a weathered leather journal, and a folded note written in faded ink. Ethan carefully opened the note. It contained only one sentence. The truth was never buried. It was waiting. Curious, he opened the journal. Most of its pages were damaged by salt water, but the final page remained perfectly readable. It said, "We didn't disappear. The lighthouse chose us." Ethan couldn't stop thinking about those words. As a marine historian, he had spent years studying forgotten shipwrecks and coastal legends, but nothing had ever sounded like this. 3 days later, carrying his camera, flashlight, and research equipment, he hired an old fishing captain to take him to Blackstone Island. The captain agreed, but before starting the engine, he looked Ethan in the eyes and quietly said, "I'll take you there, but if the light comes on after sunset, I'm leaving without you."
Ethan stopped breathing. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was standing only inches behind him. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and struck it against his palm. The light flickered back to life. The room was empty. No one stood behind him. But on the dusty wooden floor, fresh wet footprints appeared one after another. Step. 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 They moved across the room by themselves toward the bedroom door. Ethan followed them into the hallway. The footprints continued up the spiral staircase. He knew he should leave. Every instinct told him to run. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Higher and higher he climbed until he reached the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. The giant Fresnel lens stood silently in the center. Covered in dust. Rust covered every gear. There was no electricity. No fuel. The lighthouse had been dead for decades. Ethan slowly walked around the enormous lens. Then he noticed something impossible. Fresh fingerprints on the dusty glass. Someone had touched it only moments ago. Suddenly the entire lighthouse shook. The giant lens began turning by itself. One slow rotation. Then another. Rusted gears screamed as they moved after decades of silence. Ethan stepped backward in horror. The lamp inside the lens burst to life with a blinding white light. It wasn't powered by electricity. It couldn't be. The brilliant beam shot across the dark Atlantic Ocean. Far below, the sea changed. Thick fog rolled over the water. Inside the fog, a ship slowly appeared. An old wooden sailing ship from the 1800s. Its torn sails fluttered in the storm. Its hull was black with age. No engine. No lights. Yet it sailed directly toward Blackstone Island. Ethan lifted the old brass telescope beside the window. His hands trembled as he looked at the approaching ship. Figures stood silently on the deck. 3 men. Wearing old lighthouse keeper uniforms. They weren't moving. They were simply staring at him. Then, all 3 slowly raised one hand, and pointed directly at the lighthouse.
A freezing gust of air rushed out of the lighthouse as Ethan stepped inside. The smell of wet stone, salt, and old wood filled the darkness. He switched on his flashlight, revealing a narrow spiral staircase that disappeared into the shadows above. Every step echoed through the empty tower. Along the walls hung faded portraits of former lighthouse keepers. Ethan stopped when he noticed something strange. Every portrait after 1842 had been removed, leaving only empty frames covered in dust. At the base of the staircase sat an old wooden desk. Inside its top drawer, he found a thick leather logbook. The final entry was dated October 17th, 1842. It read, "The light has begun calling our names. Thomas heard it first. William heard it yesterday. Tonight, I hear it too. If anyone finds this journal, do not climb to the lantern room after midnight." The remaining pages were completely blank. Then, somewhere high above him, a heavy metallic footstep echoed through the lighthouse. Ethan froze. The metallic footprints continued, slow and deliberate, echoing down the spiral staircase. He raised his flashlight toward the darkness above, but there was nothing there. The sound suddenly stopped. The lighthouse fell completely silent. Then, from somewhere high inside the tower, a calm whisper floated through the air. "Ethan." His heart pounded. He quickly turned around, but the entrance behind him was empty. Trying to stay calm, he began climbing the narrow staircase, one careful step at a time. Dust covered every railing, and abandoned lantern tools lay scattered across each floor. When he reached the second level, he discovered a small sleeping room. 3 iron beds stood neatly against the wall. 3 folded blankets rested exactly where they had been left. On a wooden table sat an old pocket watch. It was still ticking. Ethan picked it up. The hands were frozen at exactly 11:58 p.m., the same night the lighthouse keepers disappeared. Beneath the pocket watch, Ethan found an old black and white photograph. It showed the 3 lighthouse keepers standing proudly outside Blackstone Lighthouse, smiling as if nothing had ever gone wrong. He turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink were 5 chilling words: "We never left this place." A sudden blast of freezing wind swept through the room. The bedroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Ethan rushed toward it, but before he could reach the handle, his flashlight flickered once, then twice, before everything went completely dark. He stood frozen, listening to his own breathing. Then another sound broke the silence. Someone else inhaled, slowly, deeply. It came from only a few feet away. Ethan switched the flashlight back on. The room was empty. But across the dusty wooden floor, fresh, wet footprints were appearing, one after another, as if an invisible person was walking toward the door. The footprints continued across the hallway, and began climbing the spiral staircase. Every instinct told Ethan to leave the lighthouse immediately, but curiosity pulled him forward. He followed the invisible trail higher and higher until he reached the lantern room. The giant Fresnel lens stood in the center, covered in decades of dust. Rust covered every gear, and the lamp had no fuel or electricity. It should have been impossible for it to work. As Ethan slowly walked around the enormous lens, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Fresh fingerprints were visible across the dusty glass, as if someone had touched it only seconds earlier. Before he could react, the entire lighthouse trembled. The giant lens began turning on its own. Rusted gears screamed as they came alive after decades of silence. Then, without any visible power source, the lantern suddenly exploded into a blinding white light, sending its beam across the dark Atlantic Ocean. Far below, the ocean began to change. Thick fog rolled across the water, swallowing the waves in seconds. Out of the mist, the outline of an old wooden sailing ship slowly appeared. Its torn sails fluttered in the wind, yet it moved without a sound. There were no lights, no crew giving orders, and no sign of life. The ship sailed directly towards Blackstone Island, as if it had been summoned by the lighthouse itself. Ethan grabbed an old brass telescope mounted beside the window and focused on the approaching vessel. 3 figures stood motionless on the deck. They wore the faded uniforms of 19th century lighthouse keepers. Their faces were pale and expressionless. Then, as the ship drifted closer, all 3 men slowly raised one arm and pointed directly at Ethan. At that exact moment, a voice whispered beside his ear, clear enough to steal the breath from his lungs. "Keep the light burning, or take our place." Ethan stumbled backward, unable to take his eyes off the ghostly ship. The beam of the lighthouse remained fixed on the vessel as it drew closer to the island. Suddenly, the ship's ancient bell rang once. A deep metallic sound echoed across the sea. The 3 silent figures stepped forward together. As the fog drifted away from their faces, Ethan felt his blood turn cold. They weren't strangers. They were the 3 lighthouse keepers who had disappeared in 1842. They looked exactly the same as they did in the old photograph, not a single day older. Their empty eyes remained locked on Ethan. One of them slowly opened his mouth and spoke in a dry, hollow voice. "For 184 years, we've kept the light alive." He raised a trembling hand toward Ethan and whispered, "Now, it's your turn." At that instant, the lighthouse door slammed shut below, trapping Ethan inside the tower. Ethan raced down the spiral staircase, but every exit was sealed. The heavy iron door refused to move, as if it had fused into the stone walls. Above him, the great lantern continued turning, flooding the ocean with its unnatural white light. Then the old logbook slipped from his backpack and fell open by itself. The blank pages were no longer empty. Fresh words slowly appeared across the paper, as though an invisible hand was writing them in real time. The light chooses only one keeper. The old keeper may leave only when another accepts the flame. Ethan's hands trembled as he turned the next page. A list of names filled the paper. Every lighthouse keeper since 1842 was recorded there. At the very bottom, one final line was still being written. The ink slowly formed the letters, Ethan Carter. Before the last letter was finished, the entire lighthouse shook, and the lantern above suddenly stopped spinning. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the storm outside. Without warning, the lantern burst back to life. Its brilliant beams swept across the ocean one final time before locking onto the ghostly ship below. A deafening horn echoed through the fog as the vessel reached the island. Ethan looked through the window and watched the three keepers step onto the rocky shore. They moved slowly toward the lighthouse, carrying an old brass lantern that burned with the same unnatural white flame. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed inside the tower. They were climbing the spiral staircase, one floor, then the next, coming closer with every step. Ethan searched desperately for another way out. Behind the giant Fresnel lens, he noticed a narrow iron ladder leading to the roof. He climbed as fast as he could. The freezing wind nearly threw him into the sea, but from the top of the lighthouse, he finally saw the horrifying truth. The ghost ship wasn't alone. Hundreds of silent ships were drifting through the fog, all waiting for the lighthouse to call. As Ethan stared into the endless fog, he realized every ship looked different. Some were ancient wooden sailing vessels. Others were steel cargo ships from the 20th century. A few even appeared to be modern fishing boats. Every one of them had vanished somewhere in history. None had ever returned. Suddenly, the brass lantern in Ethan's hand began glowing with the same unnatural white flame. A voice echoed behind him. The light never guided ships. Ethan slowly turned around. The three lighthouse keepers were standing only a few feet away. Their faces no longer looked human. Their eyes glowed like the lantern itself. The oldest keeper stepped forward and quietly finished the sentence. "It collects lost souls." He gently held out his weathered hand toward Ethan. "Extinguish the flame, and every trapped soul will be set free. But if you do, the sea will take your place instead." Ethan looked at the burning lantern, knowing that whatever choice he made, someone would never return. Ethan closed his eyes and made his choice. Instead of accepting the lantern, he threw it from the top of the lighthouse into the raging sea below. The white flame vanished the instant it touched the water. A blinding flash exploded across the ocean. The ghostly ships began disappearing one by one. The three keepers smiled for the first time in 184 years before slowly fading into the wind. The giant lantern shattered. The lighthouse trembled violently as stones crashed around Ethan. He barely escaped before the entire tower collapsed into the sea. When the rescue team arrived the next morning, Blackstone Lighthouse was gone. Only broken rocks remained above the waves. Weeks later, historians searched through the wreckage. They found nothing except one old leather logbook. Its final page contained a single handwritten sentence: "The light has gone out, but the sea never forgets." To this day, sailors crossing those waters claim that during the fiercest storms,